All right, now that we've got our document set up, each with its own layer of individual solid tones and colors, let's focus on adding the details to each of the different objects. Remember to take this one object at a time. Later on, we can go back and fix and overlay any other small details that may need to come up. I'm going to go down to my Layers panel. Since I'm going to work on the cup first, I've unlocked it, but I will turn on a transparency lock. This will allow me to paint all the highlights and shadows and any other details only within that cup's individual layer. Also, I'm going to go up to my reference layer. I'll unlock it for now and drop the opacity down just a bit so that I can still see my reference images, but the overall lines aren't necessarily getting in the way. I'll lock that back down, making sure to select my cup layer to work from. Next, I can pick out my paintbrush, and let's get a nice textured brush to be able to work from. I'll leave it up to you which brush that you want to be able to work with. Just make sure you're comfortable with the blending of it, and you've tested out any kind of special effect or special kind of texture that it's creating. For me, I really like this flat blunt with texture brush that was found under the basic dry media legacy brushes. Now from here, I'm going to go in and lay down my basic tones for each individual part. Since this is a mid-tone, I can work between lights and darks. I'm going to pick up on some of these darker colors. And don't feel like you have to stay with the exact color that you see in your design. You can riff and do and make this a little bit more painterly. So for mine, I'm going to pick up on some of the darker reds, maybe even pull it into a purple kind of style. Now, because I turned on the transparency lock, this makes it much easier to work just within the overall tones. I'm just going to block in my shadows for now. All right, now that I've established my tones and even some local color that I want for this particular object, let's go in and add the texture to this area. Remember, paying attention to that other reference photo that I've given, I know I want to add some rust kind of texture to this cup. Now I've already downloaded or photographed the texture that I want to use. I'm going to go to File, down to Place Embedded, and let's locate and find that texture. I believe I've got it on my desktop. There it is right here. So this rust texture is what I want to add to my picture. When I place it, do make sure that it's placed on top of the layer that you want to affect, because we're going to turn this into a clipping mask later on. I will scale it up, and we'll hit return to lock that in. Now with that texture selected, and again on top of the layer that we want, let's go up to Layer and choose Create Clipping Mask, and this will mask it into that texture. With that layer still selected, let's change out the blending modes just so that we can see what kind of effect that we're getting. Usually overlay tends to work out a little bit better, and you can see that it is showing up pretty good. If we did multiply, it would make it a little bit darker. If we did screen, obviously it's going to make it a little bit lighter. Now for me, I do like overlay. I don't like that it's adding that orange or yellowish cast to the overall thing. So this is where I'm going to go in with my adjustments. We'll go up to Image, down to Adjustments, and let's play around with the hue and saturation, and then later on we'll go to the exposure and play around with that as well. But for hue and saturation, I'm going to turn on Colorize. This will give it an overall solid tone and solid color. And I can play around with the saturation. If I brought it all the way down to gray, you can see it gets rid of the color altogether. If I brought it up, or even, let's see what it would look like as a bluish kind of tone. Meh. I'm going to make mine a little bit zero saturation, just a solid gray. So all I'm seeing is just the texture and no color is being affected. Now if I do want the texture to show through a little bit more, let's go up to Image, down to Adjustments, and let's play around with the exposure of it. With that exposure being done, now I can go on top of this, and I can make it much lighter, way too light, or darker, or I can change the offset or the gamma correction to really bring out that particular texture. I think that's actually looking pretty good for what I want. Finally, we'll say OK to that. And then finally, if it's still way too much for you, this is where you can go in and change the opacity of the layer. With that layer selected, dropping the opacity down will make the texture be much less prevalent. And I think that's actually dialing it in to look pretty good. So now, not only do I have my painting, but also I can see I've got a little bit of texture shining through. Again, there is no one particular thing you can do. You can always play around with different kinds of blending modes. Some tend to work better than others. But for me, usually overlay or these middle tones tend to give me the better kind of look and feel that I want. With that done, now I can actually go on top of this and clean up anything that's necessary by creating another clipping mask. So on top of here, I'll create one more layer. I'm going to hold down Option and click between here. This is where I'm going to change up my highlights and shadows. In this case, I'm going to do some highlights first. With that layer selected, I'm going to change the blending mode over to screen. And now when I grab my brush and I paint inside of here, it's going to lighten up any area that I have based on the color that I've chosen. In this case, I want to lighten up and make sure that these tones look really nice within the highlights. You can do the same thing for the shadows. Just make sure you're working in a darkening mode such as multiply or darken or color burn. There. Now that I'm satisfied with all of these details, let's go back down to our Layers panel one more time and select all of the different layers associated with the cup. So hold down Shift. Once you get all of them, let's group them together in a single folder, and we're going to call this group the cup group. It's always a good habit to name and keep all of your layers nice and organized in this manner. Now I'm going to focus on the ink bottle. Going down to my layers, making sure I got my ink bottle unlocked. Let's lock down my cup group so I don't accidentally work on that one. And we'll do the same thing within the ink bottle as well. So I'm going to turn on the transparency lock for now. We'll zoom in. I can see it, and let's also zoom in on our reference photo. With this one done, there's no real texture that I can add to it, so I'm just going to lock down the individual layer. And even though it's just one layer, I'm still going to put it inside of its own folder. Later on, I may go back and add something more to this. Now, since I created a group, I can click and drag this into the folder, and that's another way of adding other layers and other things within this particular item. With that one closed up, we'll call this our, whoops, didn't mean to double click on that. When you rename it, be sure to double click on the name of it. We'll call this the bottle layer. And we will lock down this one. Let's focus on doing that pen next. I'll unlock the pen. So I've done with the other ones. We'll lock down the transparency of it. And let's pull up our reference so that we can see it to work with. Maybe we'll work through the shaft of it first. So we'll get that in, and then we'll go up to the nib and the tip. With that done, let's go down to our pen. We'll lock it down completely and put it inside of a folder as well. Now I'm ready to tackle the top of that book. We'll unlock the book. With this book, in looking at our reference photo, this is also one where we need to add a linen texture on top of this. So as I start to paint, I don't necessarily need to paint every single little line that I see within this texture. Instead, I'm going to let the reference or the texture image that I'll add later to be put onto it. Instead, I'm going to focus on all of the cast shadows of each of our objects and the main little highlights and blemishes that are on top of this as well. All right, now with the top done, let's see if we can apply the texture to it. I'm going to go up to File, down to Place Embedded. Let's go to our Photos 2, and there's my linen texture that I want to use. We'll place it on top of here. Now initially I can scale it down, but I also need to put it kind of in perspective. So let's go up to Edit, Transform, and I'm going to do a distortion type warp. With this, it'll allow me to select the individual corners and to place it exactly where I want it to be while still maintaining perspective. Now, as long as I'm covering the entire area, this should be able to work. We'll hit return to lock in that transformation. With that linen texture on top of our book top, I can hold down Option, click in between those, and turn it into a clipped mask. Now from here, let's play around with the blending modes so I can see that texture without it interfering too much with the colors that are underneath it. Of course, if I choose multiply, that's going to get the nice darker darks with it. If I choose screen, it's going to get the lighter areas of it. Overlay will give me something in between, but it may get rid of too much of my area. So this is the kind of thing we really just need to play around with just to see what it could do. I kind of like hard light. I kind of like color burn. Color burn's actually giving me some good results. So with color burn, now of course it is maybe a little bit too dramatic in certain areas. This is where I can also drop down the opacity of that texture. Or I can go up to Image and Adjustments. Let's play around with the exposure of it. If I drop down the exposure, it's a lot like dropping the opacity of it or making it darker. Excuse me, if I bring up the exposure, since we're working in multiply mode. And if I do offset or gamma correction, this will bring back some of that texture and let it show through, giving it a little bit more contrast is the way of thinking about it. There we go. Just want it to be real subtle so I can see a few lines of it inside of there. And then from here I can go back in and I can clean up any details that maybe I want to add to the overall book. We'll make a new layer, on top of this one. We'll clip it into here, and just with a really small brush, a lighter texture, let's add a few more straight lines and give an idea that there is a texture going on with it. Turn the smoothing way up. Now let's hit those book pages. Again, we'll go back down to our layers, select all of our top of our book, put it into a group, book top. We'll lock it down while I'm thinking about it. And let's unlock our book pages area. For now, we'll turn on a transparency lock. And let's zoom in so we can see it. Oh, let's zoom this part out. We'll select our reference image and zoom in. All right, with that done, let's go in and add a little bit of a paper texture on top of this. Just make sure you've got your book pages layer selected. We'll go up to File, Place Embedded, and there's my paper texture that I want to use. Remember, your texture doesn't have to be exactly spot on for your photograph. As long as it's something that's close enough or something that you can work with, this is what I'm looking for. Now if I try multiply, obviously it's going to get rid of it. If I do overlay, I think it's going to lighten it up just a bit. So again, I think maybe either multiply or darken, darker color. We'll go with multiply with this. With that layer still selected, we can open up our adjustments and let's adjust the exposure to it to see if we can get it to show up a little bit better. If I bring up the lightness of it, it's going to get rid of some of the texture. If I do offset, gamma correction is really going to bring in the bite of that. I think that looks pretty good for that right there. Just out of curiosity, let's play around with some of the other different blending modes. Again, sometimes you get different results based on whatever you have. In our case, I think multiply is going to give us our best results for this one. All right, the last thing we need to do is to play around with our background, and we'll do an overall layer on top of this. Let's put these into a folder. Lock it down, select our background layer, turn it on. For my background, when I look at my reference image, especially when it's compared to my final composition image, really all I want to do is add some texture to the base that it's sitting on. And I can use that linen texture that I already have, or I could find some other texture that I think would work a little bit better for this one. Knowing what I have, maybe I'll go back and let's do a denim texture. Again, when you do image searches, do make sure you open up your tools, get a large image, and also make sure they're labeled for reuse whenever you use this texture. This is more or less what I'm looking for. I'm going to open the image in a new tab. This way it'll open up just the picture itself, and obviously you can see it's not giving me the results that I want. If I go to the actual website, I can see, yeah, this is a good one, and I can download it as the original size. It's asking me to log in, and I don't want to do that, so let's go back and see if we can find another image to work from. This one looks pretty good. See if it'll give me a little bit better results. Opening the image in a new tab, looks like it's probably going to give me the same. Nope, this is Wikipedia, so this is actually pretty good. With that one, we'll do a save as. Let's save this one as our denim texture. Jump back into our image that we're working on. Let's go up to File and Place Embedded. Select that denim texture. And then we only really want it down here towards the bottom. As we've done with the other ones, you can do a distortion of it. I do kind of want it to go into a little bit of perspective. So maybe I'll go up to Edit, Transform. We'll choose Distort. We'll put this down into a basic perspective, maybe zoom out. Now that adds a little extra dimension to the base that it's sitting on. From here we'll hit return. With that layer selected, we can zoom back in now. Let's set this to be multiplied on top of that. That's looking much, much, much better. Even if I did overlay. Overlay is a little bit too stark, too bright. Soft light actually is giving me some really good results. I kind of like the look of that. But I think it is a bit too much, so I'm going to knock down the opacity of it just a smidge. I don't want it to overpower the look and feel of my foreground type area. I want to seem like it sits right on top of it. Now I can go on top of this layer. Again, we'll lock it in to that layer. And let's do another layer on top to clean up everything that's sitting on from here. Alright, and with that I can go back to my layers panel and place all of my background layers within their own grouping. Uh-oh. Missed my actual background, so let's place it back in here and turn back on that clipping mask that we have. That looks good for that. So the last thing we can do, this by itself can be very, very finished, but what I like to do is add one more layer on top of everything that goes in and cleans up any of the edges and gives it a little bit more of a cohesive, tighter type feel. So the last thing I'm going to do is go to my layers panel. I've got my reference layer still on there, and I can keep it on there, but I'm going to add one more layer to the very, very top. With this layer, the brush that I'm going to use is going to be 100% in my flow, 100% opacity, so that whatever I paint, I can actually see on top of it. But I'm going to make some painterly marks that kind of tie in all the different parts that I have. Now, the thing that I'm looking for, if I was to do this as an actual painting, you really wouldn't have too hard of an edge between these different objects. One thing you could show is some brush strokes that kind of blend together the two different objects that we're working in. And there's a couple of different ways we can do this. One of the first ways I'll start off with is just by using a regular brush. Then maybe we'll go back in later with a mixer brush or my smudge tool and pull in some of the other colors as well. So let's say, for instance, we'll bring my brush down a little bit more. Grab some highlight colors. Let's make these highlights pop just a bit. Let's go full on white. Remember, you always want to have a good range of values. So that's what this is about, going in and fixing any little issues and letting it look a lot more painterly. Working on the side of that bottle. And sometimes I'll let a few stray colors mix within down here. Not a lot, just a touch. Just to give an idea that these are all blending and we're using the same palette. I think especially on my book, it needs to have a few more darker areas in the shadows. Bring my flow down just a bit. This is where I'm breaking that edge just to give it more of a painterly kind of edge. Pull that up a bit, that looks good. Since I'm working on a separate layer, if I feel like I've gone too far, I can always swap over to my eraser and go back, undo what I've done, and then use my brush again to put it back. Now, if blending of colors is what you really want to do, this is where I would recommend using your smudge tool. With this smudge tool, remember, you can go in and smudge and blend in two different adjacent colors. One thing you want to have turned on in this case is sampling all of the layers. This will look at all the colors that are underneath it, and it will put it on top of your new layer that's on top. So even if you do make a mistake, it's not going to mess up. So for instance, let's say I wanted to, in the background, blend in these colors a bit more. Very easily, very quickly, I can do that. Can even accidentally go outside the edge, give myself a bit of a blended edge for the back of the book. And if I make a mistake, I can grab my eraser tool and erase it away, and I haven't messed up my original painting that's underneath it. It's simply taken those colors and placed them on top of the book edge that was already there to begin with. So going back with your smudge tool, go in, find just a few places, and adjust your strength accordingly if you find it's smudging out too much. At this time, this is also a great one where you can open up some of your dry media and see if there's, or wet media. Let's see if we have it here. Yeah, there's a smudge brush that's already been created and is used by other professionals as well. And with this, our document is completely done. Tell you what, let's go in, I'll grab my pencil tool. We'll sign it at the very bottom. Whoops, turn my smoothing down, way down, make my brush a little bit larger. You don't have to sign your work, but it's always good to know who did what. With it finished, let's save this up as a Photoshop document, and I want to be able to see all the layers that you worked on. So we'll go to File. I've already saved mine, but I'll do a Save As. Do make sure your name is in that document and it's saved the format as Photoshop so I can get all of your layers. With it saved, now this document may be rather large. If I look at the size of mine and get the info on it, I can see it's well over 100 megabytes. You will not be able to upload this to the Moodle page, so you'll need to email this to me once you have it finished. Keep in mind, these larger ones do take a little bit of time to upload, so make sure you've got a good internet connection speed, you've got plenty of time set aside to be able to upload it. Best of luck, look forward to seeing what you guys create.